Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. This is the Stanley 444 and it is a despicably complex plane. Let's talk about it. The Stanley number 444 is a plane that's designed to cut sliding dovetails. It cuts both the tail and the dovetailed groove that it fits into. One tool can do both. The problem is it needs all of this stuff. This is the body that the blades fit into. Speaking of which, here I have 4 of the irons. Usually you have one large one. This is used for cutting the tails. And in this case, I have 3 of the smaller ones. These are used for cutting the groove, but we'll talk about those a little bit more. There's also 2 rods that the fence can slide on. And both of these are also fences, but they have this weird doohickey on here, which has a very special use. And then to top it all off, there are 2 of these that have knickers on them. The body also has one on here, and you can put a second one on the other side. Now, before we actually get into using this, I have to say a huge thank you to one of the viewers on our channel who is loaning this to me so I can play with it. It's one I've wanted to show off for a while, but they're relatively expensive and they're not very common. The reason they're not very common is that they take a lot of work to do. If I needed to cut 4, maybe 6 of these, it'll be faster and easier for me to just hand cut them. And any woodworker worth his salt can do them relatively quickly. Now, if I need to make a whole bunch of them, I'm making several bookcases and I need to do 30, 40 of them, then in that case, this may be very useful. It's something I can set up and I can do them all the exact same. And in that case, it does very well. It sort of does it in a production manner. But getting it there is very fiddly and time consuming and everything has to be set up just right. And you make all of one cut. And then you flip it around and you make all of the other cut. And if everything is set up perfectly, it's great. And the 2 of them fit together and everything slides into place and it's fantastic. But getting there usually ends up taking a bunch of tests to actually make it work. I've been playing with this one for around a month and it has taken me a lot to try and figure out where all the problems are, and I'll go through that when we show how to use it. But it's one of those things that even if you know all of the ins and outs, it's going to take you a little while to set it up and get it up and running. Most importantly, the irons. They're actually ground at 7.5 degrees off of 90, so they need a little bit of work, and then they're also skewed, and so these are kind of fun, and they have to be dead on. If that angle isn't right, this whole plane will not work. So these have to be good, and the bevel angle on this has to be a very, very low angle. I have them ground at 20 degrees, and they just barely work. If you take them to 25, you're going to be running into problems. The original one came with a fairly extensive set of plans and manual for how exactly all this goes together, and I have reprinted them off. And this is one of the weird things. Normally for these, I'm not going to say you need to read through the manual, but this is one you need to read through the manual. It has a lot of hints and tricks just to make this work. But all that being said, let's actually get into making this work and setting it up to cut the groove. Now, usually what you would end up doing is you'd set it up to cut the groove, and you'd cut all of your grooves across all of your shelves and anything you're going to put them in, and you do all of the grooves at one time. And then you will make your tail. So we're going to do it in that manner, and I'm going to show you what all goes into actually setting it up to make the groove. First off, we need to pick which of these angles we're going to use to actually cut in at an angle. And this will be coming in at an angle to cut out that tail in there. I can't use this one because it's too wide, and I can't use this one because it's cutting less than half the groove. It needs to cut at least half the width of the groove. So in that case, we're going to use this one to make our cut through here. So one of the problems with it is when it goes in here, we need to have a spur that cuts the grain just in front of the cutter because we are cutting cross grain. But that means we need a spur on this side and we need a spur on this side, but this cutter is thicker than the sole here. If I was using the thinner iron, then I could put the spur on this side and it is the same thickness of that sole. And so that's why it comes with these 2 body parts. These are all the differences. So the thinner of these 2 will be for the middle size, and the larger of the 2 will be for the larger size. So this little foot actually fits on here, and then we can flip it over and put a couple screws in to hold it in place. Then we can give these a little tweak, make sure everything's in place. And now we have a spur on this side as well as a spur on this side, and we can insert the iron. Unfortunately, inserting the iron on this is a bit difficult because there really isn't a good mechanism for adjusting it. You can't hammer adjust it because the head is in there. If you try to get a hammer in there, you're always going to be twisting the iron in place. So you've got to kind of play it back and forth, and you want to be taking a relatively light cut, especially on this first one. This screw on the top cranks it down in and make sure it didn't move. Of course it did move, so we got to adjust it again. And there we go, sticking out just a little bit. So now we can take the other 3 cutters and set those aside. We can take those 2 rods and set those aside. We can take the 90-degree fence and set that aside, as well as the extra spur and set that aside. And now we're just going to take that body with the iron and this cutter we put in, and then we're going to take this angled fence that locks onto here. So the way this works is I can set it in place and it slides up in here, and then we can flip this little foot around. It's a bit finicky to get just in the right place, but then we can get it in there. This is actually what determines how deep we're going to cut, but we need it to be flexible as it has to cut on a slide. So I'm going to set this with these markings on the side to be exactly how deep we want to cut, which is right about there. And then I can lock this down in. Now, this feels weird, but this whole thing is just the depth of cut, and it actually has to slide on here. So as you're cutting down deeper, this can slide in and out on this angle. So now I can come in at that groove, and I can slowly cut down at that angle. The next question we have to figure out is, where do we put this on the board? Now, thankfully, the instructions give us all the measurements dependent upon the thickness of the board and how deep we're putting it in. So I can take all of the numbers in the instructions and feed them directly into the plane. I want to put the dado through this board, but I need a fence on here for this to ride on. In the instructions it says take the fence and nail it down onto the board, but then you're going to have nail marks into your surface here. So what I'm going to do is actually use some holdfast to lock it down on. With the holdfast in place, we can come in with a square and make sure that our groove is actually where we want it to be. And I do want to make sure that I'm at 90 degrees to the edge of the board. And now for the tricky part. I need this fence to be registered up against that. And I want this to be retracted so that I'm not actually making any cuts. With one hand, I can put my thumb on here and my index finger over here to hold it in place. And then I can come back and grab this, bring it back into place, and we can run forward. One of the things you'll find is this stabbing motion, doing small sections, actually helps out quite a bit. And the reason being is that as you go forward, you get all of these chunks that come up and they wedge between the body and the side. So the return stroke actually will come back and clean them out. It is usually the most difficult, getting everything down, and there's no space in there, and so it just keeps jamming up. So you just got to keep going back and forth until you're down to depth. And now we're finally down to depth. It's not taking out any more because this pin is stopping it from going any deeper. I've gone down to that depth. Now we need to turn this around and cut the other side. But I'm going to make sure I do a better job with the spur. This time I messed up that corner a good bit because I didn't actually cut it cleanly with the spur. Then we can set up the fence on the other side according to the directions for how far away from the groove it should be. And second verse is kind of similar, but this one is actually a lot easier because you don't have everything getting in the way. There's already some groove in there. And so it actually starts cutting pretty quickly and pretty easily. And like that, we're down to depth on the second side. Now we have a relatively clean, good dado in there. I just had to make sure that on this one I actually back scored it on the first pass to make sure I get a good clean cut on there. Now with the dovetailed groove cut, we can turn our sights to the tail and cut that. So now we need to take this whole thing apart, spin this little piece off, take the fence out, pull the iron out, and you can leave this in or you can take it out. It's your choice. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it in right now because it's not going to get in the way. I do need to put these two rods into the same size as that nicker plate. And then we can take this same angled fence and we're going to flip that around and slide it on here so that the angle is actually up. We'll adjust the depth of that in a minute, but this little thing here, you're going to want to make sure you lock this down, otherwise it's going to drive you bonkers with it moving around on you. Next, I want to grab this large iron and slide that in. Again, it's really finicky because there is no depth adjustment setting. So you kind of got to play with it back and forth. That's too much. Let's back it up just a little bit. Try it again. That's too little. And you can't quite tap it without moving things around. So yeah, it's a bit of a fun one. And then this other 90-degree fence, we're going to do the same thing we did before, sliding that on here, turning this up, and we're going to set this at whatever the difference is between this point and this point on the groove. So if that's a 1/16 of an inch from there to there, then you'll set this mark at a 1/16 of an inch. But again, the plans actually give you all those numbers. When in doubt, set it a little more shallow because you can always come back and adjust it. I want to come back over here to the groove and find out exactly how deep that is. and set this depth gauge at the depth of that groove. You can do the same thing with a pair of calipers. We're going to come back over here, set it on the side, and now we're going to slide this fence up to that depth, and that is where we want to mark this in. And theoretically, this should be ready to work now. Now I want to cut the tail on the end of this, and so we can bring the tool over, and it's got this fence that registers up against the end, and it has this fence again that slides, that is the depth stop here. And so in this case, I actually want to hold it more like a regular plane. I'll put my thumb up here, and I'm going to take a pass, make sure it's actually cutting, get the spur engaged. And this one usually is a lot easier. And I'm just going to go until it stops cutting because I'm down to that depth. Then we can flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. Again, making sure it's registered up against the end. And we're keeping it nice and clean and vertical. And now we're not cutting. So then we can bring in our piece and see if we fit. And no, we're not. We're a little bit off, just like a shaving or so off. Actually, it's really, really close. If I wanted to force this, I could probably drive it down on, but I want to take just a little bit more off. So to do that, I'm going to grab this, and I'm just going to bump this little slide down by a shaving or so. Not by much. Oop, too much. Let's go down to there. And we can lock that back down, and then I can take just that one shaving. Check and make sure. Yeah, that's actually really, really good. That's right about what I want, right there. That's what I'm looking for. So now, I know I have my settings. Now I can go and do it on all the others. And now you're left with a really nice, clean, sliding dovetail joint. So, this is one of these tools that, and you can see, this is not a great one. This would have been a test run to make sure everything is up and working, and now I'd had time to go back and do a little more detail to make sure everything is running on it. And I'd want to do several test pieces before actually taking it onto the final piece. But you can see the amount of time I put into this, I could probably do 2 or 3 whole dovetail sets just by hand without having to set this up. So I mean, if I'm going to be doing 4 or so, they're much faster just to do it by hand. But if I'm going to be doing a bunch of bookcases, it might be worth my time to actually set this thing up. But then we also have to mention the other elephant in the room, and that is price. This thing is not cheap. These are very, very pricey. And most of the time they're missing things. So you're usually going to be missing 1 or 2 pieces, and you really need this whole kit in order to make it work. All of the irons and knickers and fences and rods and all of these pieces that might be separate and strewn around the house, they often go missing, and so finding one with all the pieces is relatively rare. Now that being said, I'm usually not a fan of finicky tools. I prefer to just cut it and have fun. But when this is working, and if I needed to do a whole bunch of them, this would be a lot of fun. Now, have I ever needed to do a whole bunch of them? No, I have not. So I don't need one of these, but thankfully I've got a friend who will loan one to me so that I can use it for the channel. And that's why it's not about what you know, but who you know. And sometimes it's good to have a friend with a bunch of tools, because then you can go over and say, hey, can I borrow that? I only need it once in like a decade. And that once is right now. If I ever come across a good deal on one of these, I might just go pick it up, because at some point in the future I may want to do a bunch of shelves, and I want to make them all with sliding dovetails and not just regular dados. In that case, this would be useful. Any other time, I really can't see a use for it. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Have you ever tried one of these? Are there any tips or tricks that you know? Throw those down in the comments down below. That helps out the channel. Anytime you like, comment, share, subscribe, you know I say it every week, but really it does help us out. So thank you for the engagement. Or you can just be one of those people who put comment down below, or CDB. Thank you. That really means a lot, and it does get a like from me. As well as you can go even farther and join these people over here. Those are some of the fantastic, wonderful, benevolent, gorgeous people over on Patreon. And yes, they are wonderful, benevolent, and gorgeous people, because without them, this would not exist. We are completely sponsored by you. I don't do outside sponsorships. I don't get Stanley to say, hey, show off my tool. I get to buy everything I have here or be loaned from a friend, completely sponsored by you. And that means I get to say what I want to say rather than what someone else wants to say. And that means a lot to me. So thank you. If you'd like to find out more about that, you know what to do. Links down below. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, Have a wonderful day. So Stanley came out with this plane, and it was one of those planes that they didn't quite know, what is it for? What is it for? What is it for? Oh, this is the Stanley 444. This plane is proof that Stanley liked to play golf.